Yoda, Han Solo, Leia, Chewbacca, Luke, Akbar, Lando, C-3PO, R2-D2, and Palpatine. These are all the main original trilogy characters that were brought back in the new sequel trilogy films. I wanted to take a step back and look at how the new trilogy as a whole treated each and one of these characters and see if any of them gained any type of positive development or if they just gained nothing and actually lost character development. Starting off with Han Solo because his arc ends in the first movie. I mean, well, kinda. From the moment we see Han, we know that very little of his character has changed since the original trilogy. Which is kinda weird because his character went through an entire arc during those movies. Right from the start, Han is back to only caring about his best friend Chewie, but things are different now. Han has a kid, he had a relationship with Leia. I mean, this is a different character fundamentally than when we first saw him in the original trilogy, but he's acting as though nothing has changed. When we first meet him in the original trilogy, he didn't care about anything except credit. Then later he comes around and risks his life for people that he cares about. That's a character arc. The new trilogy movies like removing all of his growth and character development and starting him back at square one where he was in A New Hope. This is a huge step back for his character and a huge character regression. I feel like they wanted to have Harrison Ford doing some iconic bounty hunter-like things that Han Solo did in the past, but that doesn't necessarily line up with the character he is today. It's like all these characters were in a cryo chamber, and then once the new trilogy film started, they all just woke up magically. This character also has no sense of urgency anymore. He's just wandering around space trying to get money. He doesn't care about his son turning to the dark side, he doesn't care about his best friend being missing. Then instead of actually developing an arc with his son and exploring that idea, which actually could have been really interesting, they decide to kill him in their first conversation. Yeah, that doesn't really do much for development. Huge missed opportunity when we don't get to see the relationship with his son, we don't get to see him reuniting with Luke, we don't get to even see him reuniting with Lando. It really feels like they made Han grow attached to Rey so that the audience would grow attached to Rey. But it's a real shame that his best relationship is with Rey, some random, versus his own actual son. Now let's talk about a character very similar to Han Solo in a lot of ways, Lando Calrissian. Starting off as a bounty hunter and then rising into his own place of esteem in Bespin, his arc in the original movies is actually a really good story. Lando as a character actually has a lot of depth to him. He's not just a stereotypical good guy, he's looking out for himself, but at the same time he does have that good moral compass. Throughout the two movies he was in, he slowly redeemed himself to the point where he even was the one who destroyed the second Death Star. He started off as a backstabbing character and went on to eventually save the entire galaxy. And this might shock you, but I actually think his character was handled pretty well in The Rise of Skywalker. In hindsight, he was one of the only original trilogy characters who really came out of the movies looking at least the same or a little better than he originally did. I think the biggest shame about Lando in these new trilogy movies is that he wasn't used earlier. He was crammed into the last movie of the three films. I think everyone coming to help Lando, a war hero who pretty much saved the entire galaxy in the long run by destroying the Death Star in the previous movie, makes a whole lot of sense. But you know what doesn't make sense? No one wanted to come to Leia's rescue in the last movie. She's literally the leader of the resistance, but Lando had a huge force behind him and nobody wanted to come for Leia. That just doesn't make sense. The point has been made before, but you can't have everyone not care in one movie and then have the entire cavalry show up in the next. It really just makes the entire galaxy seem kind of flaky. Overall, Lando's character was actually handled kind of decently. I just thought it was the right execution, but it was the wrong movie and handled at the wrong time. Yoda. His only comeback was in The Last Jedi. It was a small role, but it was a significant one. It was a role very much tied to his appearance in Empire Strikes Back. He once again speaks in riddles and sends a very important message to Luke, reminding him of who he was before he lost Kylo. And he's one of the only characters really capable of doing this now because Han is dead, and they kept Luke and Leia separated most of the movie. I do enjoy the return of the puppet Yoda in this movie, but I can't help but feel his role could have been better served to a character like Leia. It was a missed opportunity not having Luke and Leia coming together, and maybe her talking some sense into him. Overall, it was a very small role, but I think it was handled very well, and I think this scene really holds this movie up in a lot of ways. Leia. Hindsight is 2020, and not too long ago we actually learned what George Lucas had originally planned for Leia with his version of his trilogy. And I think if we got that, it actually would have ended up being more interesting than what we ended up getting with Disney's version. He actually planned to change the initial perception of the Chosen One from being Luke to Leia. I thought this was an example of good subversive storytelling, because there's already a lot of groundwork for Leia being more important than we initially realized. And I do think subversion of an audience is a useful cinematic tool to keep people guessing in a story they otherwise may have predicted. But you also have to do it in a way that doesn't completely break established universal rules, or you don't overpower them to the point where they seem unbelievable. This is my main problem with Leia's writing in the new trilogy movies. It's completely inconsistent. She goes from having no powers to having enough powers to be able to lift herself in the Force, which is something we haven't even seen Jedi Masters do. Even Rey's powers technically make more sense because we've always seen that she's OP with the Force. But Leia has never used it up until this point, and then she uses it in ways that Obi-Wan couldn't even do it. Another example of the new trilogy movies not really valuing any training time. I truly think George's vision would have been better for Leia's character overall, and it's a real shame we never got to see that in the version of Leia. Leia really felt like she was always regulated to nostalgia bait in the new trilogy. They never really gave her a character arc when the whole plot was revolved around her own son turning to the dark side, and it was a complete parallel to her grandfather, so there was a lot of wasted potential there, honestly. Akbar. This is the worst example of a character being brought back for no other reason than the quick nostalgia quip, then being tossed to the wayside. I still struggle to understand why they even bothered bringing back the original actor just to have him literally stand in the background to eventually get unceremoniously killed, where you might not even see it unless you freaking pause the screen. No, seriously. The first time I was watching that, I didn't even realize he actually died at that moment, because no one even acknowledged it. Plenty of movies bring back a character just to have them die for shock value, example Han Solo, but why barely even acknowledge the character and then have them get killed off in the background? Seriously, what was the point of bringing this character back just to trash on him? They were more freaking respectful to Nien Nunb, man. Another point I have to mention is Holdo. Who needed this character? Why were they just a stand-in for what Akbar should have been doing throughout this movie? We already have a recognizable character who's a commander for the rebels, fought multiple wars, could demand authority, and be believable. But instead they decide to throw out a character already established for a new character we haven't seen up until this point. And I'm tired of them killing off old characters just to bump up new characters. Why did Akbar have to die just for Holdo to get bumped up before her death? The main problem with the Holdo character is her coming out of nowhere and expecting all the authority of a character that we've had in the franchise for a long time. Akbar should have been the one taking charge. It would have added layers to a one-note character in the original trilogy and given him a proper send-off in a cool way,
instead of having him get unceremoniously killed and sucked through a window.
Chewbacca. In my opinion, the worst example of bringing a character back just to have them stand around and actually do nothing. Chewie was actually featured in all 3 of the new trilogy movies and was criminally underutilized. We don't even get proper send-offs for him and a lot of his original castmates.
Then in the last movies, he receives a medal.
But this is almost a slap in the
face to the original movies because Chewie did nothing in these movies.
Why now all of a sudden does he deserve a medal? I love Chewie and I actually thought he should have received the medal in the original trilogy, but they gave him one in the new trilogy just for more nostalgia bait. And then if things couldn't get worse for his character, they used him in a fake out death. And it was edited in a way where you couldn't think otherwise. Once you fake out a character's death, it makes it very hard to care when their actual death occurs because all the emotional weight was spent. A key example is Glenn in The Walking Dead.
Chewie definitely deserves better. Having that man in the costume sweating for all these years, just to have him stand around and looking cute, definitely hurts his overall legacy.
C-3PO. I'm putting him next to Chewbacca because he actually had a very similar trend. His only purpose in the new trilogy movie was to stand around and have something familiar for the audience to look at. They gave him Red Arm to try to show some semblance of change, or maybe to promote the side comic. Either way, him having a red arm means nothing to me. Anthony Daniels is one of the only legacy characters that has actually shown up in the whole Skywalker saga up until this point. And the new trilogy wanted to take that as nobody likes him at this point. Seriously, everyone is sick of C-3PO in this movie. People just act like he doesn't exist and they couldn't care less about him. With the way they wrote C-3PO in the new movies, it really gives off the vibe that the new cast of characters are dragging him around just to make the original trilogy fans happy. But it ends up making no one happy because it seems like the cast hates him and would rather him not even be there. They try to have emotional scenes with C-3PO, but none of them carry because none of the characters really care about him in that way. None of them have a connection with him because he's just shoehorned into the last movie. Then there's also the big C-3PO reset scene, which also ruins a lot of aspects of his character. But that should be obvious. Just because the old movies did something, that won't always work unless you apply it in the appropriate ways related to the scenes and characters. You can't just do something because the original movies did it. R2-D2. There's actually not much that can be said about R2-D2. He's one of the only characters I feel got the complete replacement treatment, with a newer and younger model. People love BB-8, which I think is fine. He's a lovable character. There's nothing really wrong about him. He just takes a lot of the spotlight away from R2 because he completes pretty much every purpose R2 ever served in his respective trilogies. I don't think having R2 around would really make that much of a difference compared to BB-8. It wouldn't really have made a big difference if R2 showed up more or not, but one thing that has started because of BB-8, which is a weird trend, is we now get new mini droids all the time, and they seem to be trying to make them smaller and smaller with every appearance. Palpatine. It's very well known that Palpatine's return came out of nowhere in the last film to be basically a replacement for the antagonist that we just lost, which was Snoke. There's a lot of big obvious flaws on why bringing Palpatine back out of nowhere doesn't really make sense for the story in general. It kind of goes back on Vader's sacrifice. There's one big thing set up with Palpatine and Rey that really changed the whole dynamic of Star Wars in general. To explain where I'm coming from, I'm going to go off on a little tangent, but trust me, it'll all make sense at the end. Avatar is a popular show. Avatar is a good show. It contains a lot of similarities to Star Wars, especially when it comes to the spirit world and the Force. In each Avatar series, everything in the world is very connected to the spiritual world. The shows revolve around reincarnation. This is the main focus of the series since book 1. When we see the princess reincarnate into the fish, and this theme carries through the rest of the books, and even through Korra. Actually, a lot in Korra. Now, going back to Star Wars, it's different. There's always been ideas about midichlorians and creating beings using the Force, but, and this is a big but, we have never really seen reincarnation directly, at least not in the main series of films. That's a pretty heavy theme to introduce in the last film of a 9 trilogy movie. But Star Wars decided to do just that when Palpatine said, "I am all the Sith," and Rey said, "I am all the Jedi." This one conversation threw me for a loop the first time I watched it. So you're telling me Star Wars is Avatar now? So it wasn't Luke that beat Vader, it was Kit Fisto and Ki Mundi as well. They were just in Luke's head, we couldn't hear them. Yeah, see, there's a problem here. This one battle tried to change a lot of Star Wars storytelling in my opinion, and I don't think it was for the better. It's one thing to have conversations with Force ghosts, but for all the previous Jedi to be locked in one soul consciousness, it works with Avatar because that was set up from episode 1. Unfortunately, the new trilogy liked making up lore where it suited their narrative at the time being, even though it wasn't really cohesive to the other movies that they were supposedly trying to follow up. I do think this movie actually hurt Palpatine's legacy, and unfortunately, all the Sith legacies and the Jedi's legacies. Luke. A lot of people feel similarly about how Luke was treated in the new trilogy films, so I probably won't say anything you haven't heard already. But I feel like it's still important to say because of how wrong they did his character. First of all, leaving him out of the first movie, even though he was basically marketed to be in the first movie, and a lot of people were going to that first movie for his return, just to save it in the next film, is just another way of Disney saving shit just so they can milk it more. It's really important to highlight this fact because the entire first movie was about finding his character, just to throw all of that away in the second one. Everything you liked about Luke in the first place, everything that made his character special, we're gonna flip that on its head and basically throw that all in the trash. And I'm actually not a hater of The Last Jedi. I think the approach was interesting and could have been done really well if executed in a different way.
Maybe have a little more setup for Luke in the previous film instead of making it a scavenger hunt to find him.
The Luke we see in The Last Jedi goes through one ordeal and completely gives up and shuts himself off to the world. The Luke in the original trilogy arguably went through way worse things and still got back up every time. I actually think The Last Jedi's approach to Luke is a little accurate to real life. A lot of people do get more bitter with age and realize they can't stop things and can't control things.
But it could have been such an interesting story arc seeing Luke turn into that character more.
Instead, we just get the bitter old man, but we don't get to see the youth turn into the bitter old man. The writing style of Luke in The Last Jedi can kind of come off as, well, let's just do the exact opposite of how he was in the original trilogy for subversion purposes. It may be intriguing to write these characters in a different way, in a way to surprise the audience, but that can be more useful spent on new characters instead of taking old characters and changing them. If Star Wars stays too far away from what originally made it successful, I don't think any of these new films are ever gonna recapture the initial feeling that Star Wars had. We've already seen over the years Star Wars go from a powerhouse name to kind of less than Marvel in some ways, which is something that I don't think anyone really saw happening. We live in an era where there's a lot of sci-fi out there. There isn't just Star Wars and Star Trek, but there's Dune and a lot of other stuff rising up, so people have options now. And unlike in the past, you can't just slap Star Wars on something now and have it be an instant hit. The Star Wars name doesn't carry the weight it used to have. Luke didn't really get a chance to be anything except a bitter old man who reluctantly trains Rey and has a change of heart at the very end, then dies in the span of 5 minutes. Then the Rise of Skywalker made things worse and tried to do damage control of his personality, but in the end it just comes across as him being completely bipolar at this point. Goes to acting like he's all nice again after he's been a hermit.
Completely closed off from his friends and family and the universe for years.
It really makes me sad thinking about The Rise of Skywalker, and I don't know if I could ever watch it again, because the overall sadness of me watching Luke and Leia at the end reminds me every time of how good that ending could have felt if executed properly. And The Last Shot is the only real glimpse we get of that. Overall, the new trilogy movies did kind of have a negative impact on the original trilogy characters. And not just the original trilogy characters, but the entire movie franchise itself, unfortunately. I do think that the writing in the new Obi-Wan show is miles and leagues above what we got in these new trilogy movies. And I would like to go into Obi-Wan and Anakin actually at one point in a different video. Maybe it took Star Wars messing up so bad with the new trilogy movies to finally realize what they need to do with these characters. But even Obi-Wan isn't perfect. Unfortunately, the new trilogy movies did tarnish the legacy of these characters, and hopefully we can see some, if not all, redeemed one day.